Opening the center immediately, this pawn thrust asserts an early claim for vital central squares and prepares to unleash the bishops. Fighting for central space, this Sicilian defense immediately contests white's ambition, creating an imbalanced battlefield brimming with tactical possibilities. Developing a knight towards the center, this prepares for d4 and a solid pawn structure. Developing the knight here swiftly contests central squares and prepares for pawn advances, creating dynamic imbalances from the outset. Boldly opening the center, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure and ignites a dynamic battle for central control. Accepting the pawn frees the d-file, opening lines for rapid piece development and potential counterplay in the center. Knight seizure of the central expanse, immediately challenging black's pawn structure and preparing for swift piece development. Challenging the central pawn immediately, this knight aims to disrupt white's ideal pawn structure and prepare for further counterplay. Securing central pawn territory, white aims to build a harmonious piece formation. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to develop a bishop for long-range pressure along the h8-a1 diagonal, challenging white's central space. Securing the center's tension, this development prepares for a solid pawn structure and aims to control the d5 square, potentially creating an outpost for the knight. Pivoting the bishop to the long diagonal immediately prepares for castling, and crucially, places the piece on a powerful attacking scope pointed towards white's kingside, promising future pressure if white allows it. Challenging black's fianchetto setup, this bishop eyes the weakened dark squares around the king and prepares to seize the open c-file should it materialize, creating dynamic imbalances. Attacking the bishop with the knight immediately aims to disrupt white's harmonious development, forcing a decision regarding the bishop's placement and potentially freeing up the c-pawn for future action. Refocusing the bishop to its defensive wing, this maneuver offers immediate support for the kingside and prepares to castle, ensuring its own monarch's safety while subtly eyeing the queenside potential. Securely tucking away the king is a wise precaution, especially with white's bishop poised on c4, creating a potentially dangerous diagonal. Castling on the kingside secures the monarch and prepares to connect the rooks, a vital step in centralizing them for action on open files that might soon appear after further pawn breaks. Unleashing a central pawn challenge aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and claim a stake in the critical d5 square, a bold counterattack against the seemingly cozy kingside setup. Clearing the center opens up diagonals, potentially unleashing queenside pressure, but critically, it simplifies into a position where white's bishop pair might find long-range influence. Cleverly, black redirects the knight, not only retrieving the pawn but also creating an immediate threat to white's queen and gaining a tempo for development. This maneuver cleverly disrupts white's intended pawn structure and opens up possibilities for counterplay on the d-file. Reclaiming the central square immediately simplifies the pawn structure, opening lines and potentially freeing your bishop from its cramped defensive posture, though it does concede the bishop pair for the moment. Diving into the newly opened central diagonal, the black queen immediately seeks active participation and challenges the white knight's outpost. Provoking a strategic reshuffle, the knight abandons its central foothold, aiming to disrupt black's queen's comfortable position and potentially create imbalances. Exchanging the queen here initiates a swift transition to an endgame, forcing black to reevaluate their development and pawn structure without their most powerful attacking piece. The rook's relocation to the open file immediately capitalizes on the queen's departure, establishing immediate pressure along the d-file and preparing to contest black's central pawn structure. Black attempts to resolve the awkward knight placement, but this redeployment sacrifices central influence and allows white's remaining pieces to organize more effectively. The knight on a5 was a nuisance, but moving it back to c6, while seemingly logical, relinquishes the potential for the knight to become a powerful outpost on the queenside later. Notice how white's rook on the d-file now has excellent scope, and the bishop on c4 is poised to exploit the d5 square should it become available. The king's safety of both sides remains adequate for now, but the board is beginning to simplify, and precise piece maneuvering will be paramount. Reinforcing the central pawn structure immediately tightens white's grip, preparing to exploit the slight imbalance created by black's knight repositioning. By advancing the pawn to a6, black begins to address the slight positional disadvantage created by white's knight's foray to b5, simultaneously aiming to eject the knight and perhaps gain a bit of queenside space. This pawn push, while seemingly modest, is crucial for the knight on c6 to find a more secure square if the a5 square is contested or becomes a target. It also prepares to challenge the c3 pawn, potentially opening lines on the queenside or at least forcing white to commit to a pawn structure there. This is a typical maneuver in such Sicilian structures, where queenside play often dictates the flow of the middle game. Provoking a knight dive to the 7th rank often aims to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure or gain immediate tactical opportunities. However, here it feels like a premature aggression, potentially overextending the knight before the surrounding pieces are fully developed or coordinated to support such a venture. Observe how this placement might create isolated pawns or open lines for counterplay by black, especially given the king is still safely tucked away. This aggressive pawn push might also leave the c-file vulnerable for future black incursions. Retrieving the rook from its vulnerable outpost and eyeing the now open c-file anticipates a positional struggle where control of central files will dictate maneuvering space. Initiating a positional squeeze by anchoring the bishop on a commanding outpost, this move immediately exerts pressure on black's queenside and prepares for a potential central pawn push that could disrupt the opponent's harmony. Developing the bishop to e5 solidifies control of the central squares and prepares to challenge white's bishop pair, aiming to equalize piece activity. Reclaiming the pawn and centralizing the knight after the pawn exchange creates an immediate tactical headache for black, forcing a choice between defending the attacked bishop or maintaining pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn and asserting control over the d5 square feels like the most natural response, aiming to redistribute forces and potentially simplify the position after a period of maneuvering and a slightly unusual exchange. A strategic repositioning, the bishop retreats from the aggressive outpost, seeking a more stable position from which to survey the board and potentially support advances later. This maneuver offers black an opportunity to solidify their queenside presence and potentially challenge the open file. White's intention might be to prepare for a kingside pawn push or to defend against any potential black incursions. The resulting pawn structure will dictate further development and could lead to fascinating tactical possibilities in the center. Swapping off white's aggressive bishop opens up lines and simplifies into a more balanced position, but it does cede control of the dark squares around black's king temporarily. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank dramatically alters the tactical landscape, establishing a potent outpost and eyeing weaknesses that have emerged on black's queenside, particularly the pawn on a6, now a potential target for further incursions as the material imbalance begins to feel quite tangible. Repositioning the bishop to f6 is a thoughtful attempt to regain some central influence and prepare for potential pawn pushes, although black's position remains somewhat cramped. White's knight on d5 is well placed, dominating key squares, and the rook on d1 is actively eyeing the d-file. Black needs to carefully consider how to activate their remaining pieces and challenge white's control. The bishop's new square offers some defensive possibilities and can support future pawn advances, but it's crucial to avoid creating new weaknesses or allowing white to further consolidate their advantage. The game is transitioning into a phase where careful maneuvering and piece coordination will be paramount. Fortifying the central open file is the immediate priority, aiming to consolidate the rook's influence and prevent any potential counterplay black might attempt on the d-file. Black's intention is to activate the rook along the open c-file, contesting white's control of this crucial pathway and preparing for potential future breakthroughs. The bishop now occupies a truly advanced post, surveying the entire board from its advanced perch and aiming to disrupt black's coordination. An audacious repositioning of the knight, aiming to disrupt white's central control and perhaps set up a later attack on the queenside. Shifting the bishop back to its initial square of discovery aims to prepare for an eventual advance of the e-pawn, potentially creating a passed pawn down the center if black isn't careful, while also indirectly supporting a future kingside pawn push. Securing the e6 pawn with an advance creates a more robust pawn chain, fortifying the central structure and offering a potential outlet for the bishop currently hemmed in behind it. This proactive step aims to consolidate black's position, aiming to transition towards a more stable middle game where piece activity can be prioritized over immediate pawn defense. Reasserting presence on the d-file now that black's bishop is no longer tied to defending it from that square. This repositioning aims to build pressure towards black's somewhat exposed kingside and prepare for potential pawn advances, while also keeping an eye on the central tension. Reinforcing the queenside pawn chain is the immediate purpose, while also preparing to contest the now rather exposed c-file. Repositioning the bishop to the dark squares creates a more robust defensive net and eyes the potential for a king's side attack later. Averting an immediate pawn squeeze, black prioritizes safeguarding their monarch, acknowledging the potential discomfort a centralized white bishop might inflict, while also preparing for future endeavors on the kingside. Consolidating control over the queenside and preparing for potential queenside expansion, this move nudges the pawns into a more harmonious arrangement. Shaping the pawn structure for the long game, this step prepares for a more active rook presence on the c-file, indirectly influencing the central tension. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain against any immediate black incursions, this quiet maneuver also opens a subtle pathway for the king to potentially find safety later. Strategically, this action aims to create a more robust defensive platform on the queenside, anticipating future positional skirmishes. This subtle repositioning of the b-pawn lays the groundwork for a potential queenside pawn majority, hinting at endgame aspirations. Attempting to create some counterplay on the kingside, black initiates a pawn advance, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for his pieces. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure is the immediate aim here, preventing any pesky knight or bishop intrusions down the h-file. Pivoting the rook to the center to support a potential kingside advance, this maneuver aims to consolidate black's position while eyeing opportunities to contest central files, potentially preparing for a pawn storm or tactical skirmishes. Unlocking the c-file for potential infiltration becomes white's immediate priority, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create imbalances. The knight's repositioning aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially seize control of the d4 square, though it sacrifices immediate activity for potential future gains on that side of the board. Reclaiming the outpost with the bishop aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially create long-term weaknesses, a classic strategy of harassing the opponent's pawn chain from an unexpected angle. This pawn push advances your kingside presence, potentially opening lines for future activity or creating a safe haven for your monarch against any stray rooks or bishops. Repositioning the bishop to f3 subtly reclaims influence over the d5 square, potentially preparing to support a pawn push or to contest the open files that have become so critical in this tense endgame. Finally, black challenges white's entrenched bishop, seeking to disrupt the cramped defensive setup and open up some counterplay. Probing for weaknesses along the 7th rank, this piece boldly ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially exploit the weakened kingside by creating long-range threats. Boldly challenging the rook's central presence, this knight's repositioning aims to disrupt white's positional grip and potentially unlock counterplay by attacking the advanced bishop. Seizing the passed pawn on b7 suddenly injects a dangerous dynamic into this otherwise rather static position, potentially creating a powerful threat that black will struggle to contain without significant concessions. Finally, a simplification that resolves the queenside blockade and brings the knight into a more active position, although the pawn structure around the black king remains a significant concern. Seizing the open file now allows for immense pressure on black's weakened pawn structure, a direct consequence of the earlier pawn advances and the king's exposed position. A bold attempt to initiate counterplay on the kingside, but it sacrifices valuable development time and potentially weakens the kingside pawn structure in the long run. Clearing the path for the pawn to march forward, a bold step to seize central territory and disrupt black's coordinated defense. This pawn advance suddenly activates the queenside, creating a new avenue for counterplay and potentially destabilizing white's pawn structure on that flank. Unleashing the passed pawn on c6 not only creates a formidable highway towards promotion, but also severely restricts black's pieces, particularly the knight that was previously so active. The bishop on b6 now enjoys an even more commanding post, pinning down the queenside and ready to support the pawn's advance. Black's king finds itself increasingly confined, with few safe squares to maneuver into. This pawn push transforms a positional advantage into a direct, tangible threat. Unleashing pawns on the queenside now allows black to penetrate the king's defensive bulwark, transforming the game into a sharp struggle where precise calculation around the exposed monarch becomes paramount. Repositioning the bishop to the a7 square establishes a crucial diagonal stranglehold, menacing black's potentially exposed king and creating complex tactical possibilities on the queenside. Initiating a central pawn push to challenge white's queenside control, this advance seeks to pry open lines for the rook and create counterplay. Unleashing a passed pawn's might, this advance seizes the 7th rank, creating a formidable outpost that black will struggle to dislodge. Attempting to activate the bishop along this exposed diagonal offers a desperate bid for counterplay, as black's pawns are already being systematically dismantled. Opening the c-file with the bishop exchange immediately sets the stage for a dynamic endgame where the king's safety becomes paramount. Capturing the pawn opens up the g-file and creates a clear pathway for the remaining rook to become active, potentially leading to a dangerous discovered attack against the white king should the pawn advance further. The rook's return to the 7th rank now directly challenges black's isolated pawn on g8 and prepares to infiltrate, potentially dominating the now open h-file if black isn't careful with their king's safety. Unleashing the rook to the 7th rank was a bold sacrifice. Now the challenge is to activate that isolated king's pawn and try to create counterplay on the queenside before white's pressure overwhelms everything. Opening the c-file with this rook redeployment forces black to actively defend their weak pawn structure and creates immediate pressure along the 7th rank, potentially isolating key enemy pieces. Activating the king seems like a reasonable attempt to find a more dynamic role for it, although it ventures into a pawn-heavy territory that might prove difficult to navigate. The king's newfound liberty on the f1 square signals a strategic repositioning, aiming to bolster its defenses by connecting with the remaining rook and preparing for potential skirmishes on the kingside. King repositioning to the center of the board to participate in the pawn fight. The capture of black's bishop rips open the central files, creating a decisive advantage for white. This decisive exchange transforms the positional struggle into a clear path towards victory. The black king, now exposed on the g8 square, faces a precarious situation as white's rook infiltrates, threatening immediate checkmate possibilities and a relentless assault on the remaining pawn structure. The king's journey from the center to the wing is now complete, aiming to offer support in this tense, drawn-out endgame where pawns are the primary combatants. The black king, now exposed after the rook exchange, must urgently seek shelter, and this retreat to d7 aims to achieve that, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the central files. Reactivating the king's central presence is paramount now that the doubled pawns on the c-file are no longer a direct threat. A well-placed monarch can become a formidable force in the endgame, potentially supporting an advancing pawn or even participating in direct combat. Reactivating the rook on the open e-file presents an immediate challenge, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create new attacking avenues. Suddenly, the promotion of the c-pawn into a queen fundamentally alters the board's character, introducing a decisive attacking force that black can only desperately attempt to parry, turning this into a race against overwhelming material advantage.